I want to now invite others to ask their own questions. We've had a rich conversation spanning many centuries on a variety of crucial topics, and this question of whether the development of doctrine that the Catholic Church experienced, not a rupture, as George Weigel said, but a kind of a deepening reflection on its own foundational sources and materials, whether that in some way might have an analog in Islam. This is not just an important theoretical question, but of course an important practical question for Christians facing persecution around the world. Please, Sir Thomas, and please identify yourself before you ask your question, and do try to be as brief as you can.
I will. I'm Thomas Johnson. I'm Human Rights Advisor for the World Evangelical Alliance. I had a question for George Weigel. You talked about the Catholic human rights revolution in the second half of the 20th century. I think, as we've heard yesterday and today, we need a new human rights revolution. What can be done, in your opinion, to ignite a new human rights revolution? I express it especially to Mr. Weigel because he used that phrase, but as well to the rest of the panel.
Well, let me go back to something I would have raised yesterday and might raise tomorrow if I have an opportunity. You know, on this question of religious freedom, which I think anyone who's spending 3 days here agrees is at the center of any such human rights revolution, it has to be religious freedom in full. There has been an evacuation of the content of that phrase in recent years in the West, and I regret to report what most of you know already, particularly in the United States government over the past 7 years. Insofar as I'm aware, neither Secretary of State Clinton nor Secretary of State Kerry has ever used the term religious freedom in a speech. They always talk about freedom of worship. Well, freedom of worship is one part of religious freedom, but it is by no means religious freedom in full. So to make clear in our own advocacy, and I think this was done on the previous panel before lunch very nicely, that religion is a community-forming, culture-forming reality in the human condition, and that religious freedom, rightly understood, takes account of the integrity of those communities to live their lives, celebrate their worship, conduct charitable activities, invite others into the community of faith, provide social services, choose their own ministers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't just stop at the door of the mosque or the synagogue or the church. The other thing I think that would be essential is making an essential part of this movement you're describing is to understand that democracy is not a machine that can run by itself. I loved my old friend Thomas Halleck's phrase this morning, a moral biosphere for democracy. Well, the public meaning of that moral biosphere in constitutional and positive law is human rights. But there's an awful lot of the democratic world today that does not acknowledge the need for that moral biosphere, and indeed seeks to marginalize the institutions, primarily but not exclusively religious, that go to build up that moral biosphere, to exclude them from public life. So those are two things that come to mind to me.
Yeah, I wanted to underscore what George said about the corporate dimension. I think the story truly told, it took the Catholic Church a long time to get its head screwed on correctly in modern times, that it was an idolatry of the state, and we needed to defend our own liberty. I think it was providential that we first made our argument on the basis of our corporate liberty. Had we defended religious liberty in the fashion of the Enlightenment, we would have defended the authority of the individual over his own inner life, and like the U.S. Constitution, would have never said a word about corporate religious groups, which are today largely a legal fiction drawn out of corporate law and other areas. So we landed first to defend the entire enchilada. Right? To defend the liberty of the church is not just to defend the internal freedom of conscience. And then we had another 100 years to figure out how to reframe the Enlightenment position with regard to the individual. And we made it very clear in Dignitatis. It includes the corporate and especially the family under religious liberty as the first teacher of the child, having solemn responsibility over the child learning about the divine, these kind of things. And so now we find in the United States, in questions of religious liberty, the older Lockean people are kind of, they don't understand how to argue the constitutional issues anymore because they have to get from the individual to a corporate liberty. And that's not easily done. But if you can begin with a corporate liberty, it's much easier to move to the individual liberty and to have, as George said, the entire toolkit of this. And this is why it's Catholics in the large part who are pressing the issues before our court on corporate religious liberty. And so we came late. But when we showed up with the whole philosophical, theological, and juridical toolkit. And I think we're all better off for that experience.
To quote Cicero again, tempus fugit. I'm going to ask that we actually have a few questions clustered together. I'm going to invite maybe 2 or even 3 people to ask a brief question so we can have more of a chance to hear from members of our audience. Ron Cruz, yeah. Please tell us a bit about yourself.
Ron Cruz with Chaplain Alliance for Religious Liberty. My question is for Mustafa. Do you have concern for your own safety to be able to express what you express in our community, and are you able to express what you express in our community among the Muslim world more broadly?
Thank you, sir. Well,
and could we? I just want to hear let's hear from Pascal Warda as well.
So,
Also from Mustafa?
Yeah.
Okay.
thank you very much for your intervention. I would like just to pose a question. I pose it in Baghdad to my friends and colleagues, professors and judges in Baghdad. It's as Muslims, because as you declared very, very nice, we have many tendencies in Islam, and we have many interpretations, and we have historically many interpreters of Quranic principles, etc., which is more and more difficult to really unify an idea. How you, like thinkers, you see your role in this, inevitable progress which Muslim people wait and have to have, like everybody in all societies, inside a globalized people, a globalized, world. Muslims, like everybody, have this right to go to the end of their questions, how they have to live and what they are living and why they are living this. So I think, I don't know, thinkers, do you have any role to add something on sheikhs and on imams and on different interpretations to really join the words? Because we have this problem, and me, like Christian, living in Islamic world, I have many things to say, but not now.
Thank you.
It's just a question, do you have a role like thinkers? Because all societies were liberated also with this help of thinkers, of people who would like to address an issue which is not really which is more and more showing the bloody action. So please, just tell me which role you have in Baghdad. I have no answer because everybody is, fear another. So
Thank you. So Mustafa, 2 questions.
Sure, we can combine them. Do I have a
Yeah.
role, and will I be beheaded for that role?
Yeah, it's a simple, yeah,
Basically,
put them together. Yeah.
Well, thank you for questions. Well, as for the role, I, as a modest Muslim writer, am trying to share my ideas with fellow Muslims. I mean, I have a book published in English, actually, but translated to Turkish, Indonesian, Malaysian, and Arabic version is coming out. I speak to fellow Muslims in the West, in the East, and I try to share these ideas. Whoever gets persuaded, that's win, you know, but there are a lot of Muslims to persuade, like 1.5 billion people. But there are also a lot of Muslim voices, like my humble self, in every Muslim society who are asking for change and reinterpretation. And there are already scholars who make the theory of it, some fatwa, but maybe that scholar is not very popular. I popularized the idea, put it into a narrative, and so we were trying, really. This trial will not happen by going out on American televisions and say, Islam is actually horrible, I'm actually an infidel, but we need a reform, you know. That's, for example, is not a big help. You know, we see that kind of attitude, but you need to speak within the community and within the tradition. And there are, trust me, people who try to do that. They don't make the news because wild and horrible people make the news. So, but there's a lot of effort for reinterpretation in the Islamic world. Am I fearful about what I'm saying? Not really. I mean, if I were living in Mosul or Raqqa, yes, I would be probably beheaded the next day. I'm ISIS capital. In Turkey, you can discuss these issues. In Turkey, if you criticize the president, you might have some problems, but that's not an Islamic issue.
You
That's
have
a
some
kind
experience of that.
That's a kind of a Russian Putin-esque kind of problem that's really not Sharia related.
Yeah.
But besides that, I mean, in Turkey, at least we do have like an intellectual setting that reformist ideas about Islam are freely expressed and they are talked. Some people will find you too reformist, too kind of wishy-washy from their traditional perspective, but you won't be killed for that. I mean, we don't have a tradition for that, or the laws do not make this a crime. But there are other parts of Islamic world that, you know, speaking for change, reform, ijtihad can put you in trouble. And luckily, where I'm living is not a big problem in that regard.
Great. We'll have another couple of questions clustered together. Kieran Raval, proud to say a Georgetown alumnus, now at Oxford.
Yes, thank you. Very quickly, I'd like the panelists, whoever would like to perhaps comment on Professor Thomas Pink's interpretation of Dignitatis as the church can coerce and authorizes the state to do so on its behalf and then withdraws that authorization in Dignitatis. Interested in your thoughts on his interpretation.
And Ambassador Andrew Bennett.
Getting back to the point I made earlier, and that is the difference in language now that we face, particularly in the West. The understanding of human rights has been changed fundamentally from the understanding of human dignity and Dignitatis Humanae, I would argue. The rights have been divorced from the human. Rights we've sort of held up on this altar that we bow down before, but they're not connected anymore with humanity. So I'd be interested in both Russell and George's comments on this, because when we speak about human dignity in the Catholic sense, we're speaking about the human person that bears an image and a likeness and so forth, and that is not understood. Generally speaking, I would say amongst the world that I engage in and the world that many of us engage in either as academics or as diplomats. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Thomas Pink and separation of rights and personhood.
If I were feeling uncharitable, I would say of the Pink argument that it reminds me of what George Orwell said about some things that only intellectuals could believe, because they're
But
so...
you're not being uncharitable.
But I'm not being uncharitable. I will simply suggest in fraternal correction that Professor Pink perhaps needs to meditate a little more on what Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger said in the second instruction on Christian freedom and liberation: God wishes to be adored by people who are free. Period.
Yeah, it's an argument too clever by half, but according to canon law, and this is long held, No sacrament can efficaciously be coerced on the part of either the minister or the recipient. And that includes baptism. Okay. Just purely coerced. And therefore, since the church cannot coerce people into its supernatural life, I can hardly see how the church could delegate it to someone else. Argument over.
Great. And on Ambassador Bennett's question about rights and personhood?
We have, because rights language does not begin with the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
So it actually, it begins in the ancient world, but is very well developed by Catholics before others get a hold of it in the medieval schools. Vigorously used in the 16th century and 17th century missionary work.
De las Casas.
I mean, just fantastic and exciting uses of philosophy and theology of rights. So for the Catholic tradition, we've never had the discourse of rights separated from the anthropology and from the theological anthropology even. And it's another reason why it's probably good that the Catholic Church, as fuddy-duddy as it was back then, didn't grab a hold of the Enlightenment version of rights to make its case, because it's very thin, anthropologically very thin. In fact, they themselves don't believe it anymore. So.
I want to try to...
The ultimate warrant, I think, for a, does have to be worked out theologically, but for a Catholic use, a Christian use of rights language, of personhood language as the foundation, is Trinitarian theology. And we should, at least within the household of faith, not be reluctant to talk about that. Mm-hmm. That our personhood is a reflection of the divine personhood imprinted in the world, and the divine community imprinted in the world.
I want to try to get a couple more questions in. I think we do have I think a little more time if my colleague Dan Philpott permits us to take another couple of questions. I'd like to get two more questions in. Our friend can start, and then Dr. Malik. Yeah, please. And please introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you. I'm Laili, and I'm the Notre Fellow from Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue for this year. And I'm also Notre Dame graduate. So my question will be, well, forgive my ignorance because I just started to studying Catholicism seriously in Rome. So my question will be, on the one hand, we have this beautiful principle of religious freedom embodied in the Dignitatis Humanae. But on the other hand, there is also a systematic effort from the authority of the Catholic Church to restrict some cultural, individual expression of religiosity in ways people express Catholicism, such as what happened in the Philippines with the veneration of Saint Mary, for example. There are boundaries which says that this is the formal tradition and this is the popular religion, which is not be included in the formal tradition. So I just want to know how do this beautiful principle of religious freedom plays out in the context of popular religion in the Catholic Church itself. And I have 2 points.
Quick,
yes.
Please, very quick. We're running out of time.
I have 2 points to add about the Islam-related questions that has been directed to Mustafa. The first thing about human rights, I think it's important for us to remember the concept of fitrah in Islam, which is the embodied human rights that's come from the relation from individuals with God, even before the human were born. And the second point, I think a lot of negative perspective is directed toward Islam, because I think to some extent there is a kind of Arabocentrism in Islam. If you try to look at Muslim world in Bosnia, for example, or Muslim world in Southeast Asia, which is some kind of periphery in the larger context of Islamic studies and larger context of Islamic imagination, I think you will get a very different narratives and
Great.
Depiction of Islam.
Thank you. Thank you for wonderful comments. Professor Malik.
Very quickly, Mustafa, how ambitious can we be? In other words, can we think specifically on taking from within Islam, because you mentioned the Hanafi tradition, taking on the Hanbali tradition and naming things the way they are, because ISIS didn't invent anything. It's all there in a tradition that is still alive, and it's the Hanbali tradition. What about going back to precedents like the Mu'tazila and Ikhwan al-Safa, and the fact that they raised the issues of whether the Quran is created or not? And so, eventually they ended up being suppressed. But I mean, is that an experience to learn from? What about, asking the question of whether in Sunni Islam we can reopen the door to ijtihad, which is still open in Shiite Islam, but it's closed in Sunni Islam. Things of that sort. Am I daydreaming? Is this a generational thing that's going to take 300 years? Or can something start from within Islam in that direction?
Thank you. Now, what I'd like to ask is that we answer the questions as we can, starting with you, Mustafa, but then I'd like to ask George and Russell to answer questions that came up that are relevant to you, but also make any closing remarks, including about the current way the church should respond to persecution today. Mustafa.
Well, I agree very much with the Arabocentrism comment. The Arab world has deep problems. Not all of them are related to religion. It is related to artificial borders, tribalism, history of colonialism, the Arab-Israeli conflict, which are not religious issues actually, but we religionize them, and the Arab societies have religionized them. But so we should also, of course, look beyond that. And yes, Indonesia, Bosnia, these are very interesting examples of a whole different Islam. My wife is from Bosnia, so I have a heart for that, and I know that, and Indonesia is very important as well. You raised very important questions. In chapter 3 in my book, Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty, which is available on Amazon if you're interested, I address...
Paperback.
Paperback, good deal. It's a good read. I address those issues. Indeed, there are some very interesting medieval debates in Islam that was sealed off, and we were told, this is the orthodoxy, stick with it. But actually, when we go back early Muslim debates, they're fascinating ideas on the role of reason, on whether we should punish the heretics or leave the judgment to afterlife, to postpone it to afterlife, to be sold by God. So there are actually roots of liberal and rational thinking which got eclipsed to a great extent. The Hanafi side in Sunni Islam carried that to some extent to our day, but Hanbalis were the most rigid, and it is revived under Saudi Arabia, actually, but in a more extreme form, ISIS today. What ISIS is doing is that, on the one hand, ISIS is so fanatic and so radical that even Al-Qaeda is horrified by some of its crimes. So it is the craziest, it's the Khmer Rouge, if you will, of Islamism, which was so bad even for most communists at the time. But on the other hand, ISIS is showing us that some of the stuff in medieval jurisprudence textbooks, which nobody implemented, forgot, what it means today if you really go crazy, literal, and implement it. So in that sense, it brings to some of the issues in the closet about apostasy, about heretics, and so on and so forth. Therefore, it is very marginal, but also it's a wake-up call for all the maybe Sunni Muslims saying that, well, we have some troubles in our tradition, and here is that trouble on steroids, and I think that's how we should see it.
Closing thoughts from you, George?
Very, very briefly to the question that was posed here, the Catholic Church does not wish to coerce anyone into adhering to the Catholic Church. Freely adhering to the Catholic Church means freely adhering to its structure of authority, which means you can't make up the Catholic Church by entering it. The Catholic Church exists, and different experiences stretch the Church's self-understanding, as they've done over 2,000 years. But religious freedom does not mean the freedom to enter a community and then reconstruct it according to your self-understanding. I mean, that would be, in fact, a very theologically thin understanding of religious freedom. In the questions that Tim had sent out for us to ponder a couple of weeks ago, The last one was, is the situation with respect to persecution different than what it was at the time of Dignitatis Humanae? Very briefly, I would say in some senses it's worse. Now, I'm very aware of what Thomas Halleck said before lunch about that great joke about the sign in the synagogue, and, don't tell me it's worse. But there is something worse about our situation. Communism was the greatest killer of Christians in history by orders of magnitude. But the nature of the conflict was clear. Today, the nature of these conflicts is not so clear, because Christians generally know absolutely nothing about the ideological, theological, philosophical, psychological roots of what Mustafa was just describing. But even more to the point, for those of us who are free to come here, our own liberal states are infected by what Benedict XVI called the dictatorship of relativism, the use of coercive state power to impose a public order of moral relativism. And that means there aren't models available for what Tom Johnson was talking about, or at least we have to reach back a few decades before the present challenges emerged to find those models, and that makes things more difficult. We have less to brag about, if you will, right now in the West because of the development of a particularly aggressive form of secularism. And I think that has to be part of the conversation about the new movement. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Catholic Church, 21st century, the only major religion that has no establishment in the world. And it can hardly run its own.
All right.
But we have no establishments.
On that note, please join me in thanking our distinguished panel.
It was an honor. Great.